People coming into the room now, and as people are joining us, hi everybody, as you're coming into Warwick's event on release day of, I was telling Amelia and Abigail in the green room, this beautiful cover, but even better, what's inside the pages. Oops, I've got Sarah's note there. Oops, sorry. What's inside the cover of Wayward. Amelia, I read this so long ago, and I just am so excited that today is the day that it's out in the US. So congratulations.
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah, no, I'm thrilled.
Excellent. We're so excited. We're so honored to have you on release day. It's so much fun. I just love that we get release day things. And so thank you to St. Martin's for allowing us. If anybody's here from St. Martin's, thank you for allowing us to host on release day. So for those of you that are joining us and settling in, just wanted to let you know that we are doing this event today in partnership with Book Carnival, Novel Neighbor, and Roundabout Books and Cafe. And so we've got some great independent bookstores who helped customers of those bookstores, along with Warwick's, that helped put this on today. So thank you to those stores. If there's anybody from those stores that are with us in the chat, I'm going to put how to order Amelia's book, and I'll put Abigail's book in there as well. And so if the other stores are here, feel free to link to your stores as well in the chat. I believe I set this up where we all can chat, but there we go. I think that everybody can chat on this, but hold on. There we go. Just made that little change. So now y'all can chat. I was telling them in the green room too a minute ago, it's like, you're looking at the tech tape. So if anything goes wrong, just yell at me. So just real quick about Warwick's, I was talking to them also in the green room. Emilia and Abigail are joining us from London today. And we are at Warwick's is at the complete tip of the other end of the US continent down in San Diego, California. So hoping that we've got people from all across those areas joining us today with this great event. If you are in San Diego, we'd love for you to stop by the store, pick up Amelia's book. But like I said, we'll click in there and you'll be able to ship it to you anywhere in the US. So with that, I'm going to introduce these two wonderful authors. Go off screen. They're going to chat for about 35 minutes, and then we'll bring questions. So there's a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. If you have any questions, don't be shy, put those in there and we'll bring those to the conversation in just a little bit. So Emilia Hart grew up in Australia and studied English literature at university before training as a lawyer. Wayward is Emilia's debut and was highly commended by the Caledonia First Novel Prize. Joining Emilia today is Abigail Dean. Abigail is the instant New York Times bestselling author of Girl A. She works as a lawyer for Google, and before that was a bookseller. Abigail's working on her second novel that we can't wait for. Love that you both are lawyers. I think that's awesome. Oh, that's just like, I think that's one of those things that's like, when I saw it, I was like, oh, this is great. So anyways, ladies, have a great conversation. We'll see you in a little while with some questions from the audience.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Julie. And thanks to everyone who's joining us today. Emilia, huge congratulations on release of Wayward. I'm just super excited to be here as well because I loved this book. I adore the characters. I adore the setting. I think it is such a beautiful, powerful feminist novel. So yeah, thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you so much. Honestly, I'm so grateful to you for taking part in this event, and so grateful to Warwick's and the other bookstores for hosting us. And yeah, it just means so much to me to have like a lovely endorsement from you, because I really love your book as well. Girl A is such a phenomenal novel and one I'll never forget. So thank you.
Thanks, Emilia. So I wanted to start off by asking you about the three women at the heart of Wayward, because for me they were the heart of the book, and in their own ways they're each so powerful. So I wanted to ask about the origin of the women, and if there was one voice that came to you first, and if you can just tell us a bit about them.
Yeah, sure. So there are three women, the three Wayward women, and while they're in quite different time periods, they're all connected by one place, which is Wayward Cottage, a remote cottage in Cumbria, and it holds a secret that is pivotal to all of their lives. So firstly, we have Kate, and she's our sort of modern day way into the story. She's living in London in 2019, and she flees an abusive relationship for Wayward Cottage, which she has inherited from a mysterious great aunt who she can't really remember. And then we also have Violet. She's a teenager in the 1940s. She's growing up in Orton Hall under her father's very kind of strict confinement. And she is really curious about the natural world. She loves insects. She has a pet spider called Goldie, and she longs for information about her mother, who she never knew and who is not discussed in the household. And then finally, we have Altha, and she's furthest back in time. She's in the 17th century, growing up in Wayward Cottage. And when we meet her, she's in her early 20s, and she's become embroiled in the witch trials that are sweeping across England at the time. And I think, so your question about which voice came through strongest is a really interesting one, because I think really it was Kate. So because I started writing this book in the pandemic, and I was living in Cumbria at the time, and I was sort of thinking about confinement and escape. And so I had this image in my head of this woman kind of fleeing her life in the city and the kind of restrictive circumstances there, and then taking refuge in this sort of magical landscape and finding this legacy from her ancestors. So her voice came through really strongly, and then Alpha's did as well. And then I realized I needed like a link between the two because they were so far apart in time. And that's when Violet came in. And I think she was my favorite character to write because, you know, although she goes through quite a lot of turmoil and tragedy in the novel, I think she's really like optimistic and hopeful. And I really love the way she looks at the world.
I loved her voice because she's so kind of pragmatic. And I think especially sort of in the earlier scenes as well, she has just that real like childlike wonder with like nature and the natural world. And it's so endearing.
Thank you. Yeah, I wish I was more like her. I think I don't have that same like affinity with insects because growing up in Australia, like, you know, I'm quite conscious of how dangerous they can be, especially spiders.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I feel like growing up in Australia would not endear. You don't want those black widows anywhere.
Yeah, don't want them anywhere near you.
So I guess it sounds as if you spent some of lockdown in the Lake District, and the sense of place of Wayward Cottage is incredible, and I guess nature and the kind of wildness of nature plays such a beautiful role in Wayward. What do you make of the Lake District? Like, what made you think this is where the novel's going to be set?
That's such a great question. I think the reason that the Lake District is so important to me is because it was like my first real encounter with the English countryside. So, you know, I'm obviously from Australia, but I've lived in the UK for almost a decade, but mainly in London, where I live now. But at the time of writing the novel, I was living in Cumbria. I was staying with some friends there for the pandemic. And I think it really shattered my kind of like preconceptions about English countryside as being this like green and gentle, like non-threatening kind of place. You know, still beautiful, but kind of like quite calm and sweet, you know, like that kind of idyllic image. But Cumbria is not like that. Like it's really like majestic and powerful. Like the landscape's quite dramatic. I guess it kind of reminds me of Australia in that way. You know, there are these, you know, beautiful fells and gorgeous becks and like dark, mysterious woods. And I think I found all of that really inspiring, like, you know, and rejuvenating in a creative sense. And then also, I kind of learned while I was living there that while the landscape was so beautiful, there was like a sort of dark history like lying beneath it, because of the Pendle witch trials, which were the inspiration for the novel, or for the witch trial element of the novel. And those took place in Lancaster, so quite close to where I was staying in Cumbria. And I thought that kind of juxtaposition between like the beautiful landscape and this terrible history of misogyny was really interesting.
Yeah, I love the combination of sort of beauty, the beauty of the landscape, which is a really wild beauty, with that kind of bleakness of things that have happened there. And I know Pendle Hill as well, having like lived relatively near there as a kid. And it's very like ominous. The witch trials, and particularly kind of Alpha's role there, is such a sort of frightening aspect of the novel. And was it quite disturbing to sort of read into that? I mean, I know it's hundreds of years ago, but also it's not that many hundreds of years ago.
Yeah, it definitely was. I think the thing that really struck me was how sort of widespread this phenomenon of like witch hunting and like witch trial hysteria was, because, you know, I guess like we have this image in our heads of it being something, you know, like, you know, associated with like Puritans, like Salem, for example, like, but this was something that also happened in Catholic countries, like in continental Europe, like in France, for instance. And then obviously it was in Scotland and England and spread to North America and went on for like, you know, a couple of centuries and resulted in the deaths of thousands of women. And it was like upsetting to read about that, and to read about how like confessions were extracted from these women, like they were tortured, and the kind of women who were targeted as well. You know, often it was, I think, women who sort of threatened like the kind of feminine ideal of the time, like women who lived without men in some way, or perhaps who were childless or who were poor. And interestingly, the Pendle witch trials, the women who were accused there were mainly from two families, each one headed by a matriarch. And I found that really interesting. Like they were kind of perceived as a threat in some way, particularly like, you know, they were making their money through traditional healing means and were doing that like without a male breadwinner. So I thought that was really interesting. And then I think, yeah, it's I feel like in a sense we haven't really grappled with this history of misogyny, and you know, yeah, and I think that's maybe why the idea of like witches and witch trials kind of still resonates today, like in fiction.
Yeah, it's really I think it's so much of it, as you said, seems to have been born out of kind of fear of women. I think that links really well to your point around like the idea that these two families obviously, or perhaps potentially, intimidated in some way because they were headed by matriarchs. And I wanted to check if it's okay for me to read the quotation from the end of Wayward, and that you wouldn't see that as a spoiler because it's such a great quotation. I have like a few questions about it. Is that okay?
Yeah, of course, go for it.
This is an Adrian Rich quote that is at the end of the novel, and it says, "The connection between and among women are the most feared, the most problematic, and the most potentially transforming force on the planet," which are such beautiful words. And I guess I wanted to ask, kind of, do you, I mean, I guess to some degree you agree with that, and how did you want to kind of instill that in the novel, like these incredible connections between women?
I love that question. Yeah, I really adore that quote. And I was, you know, really wanted to have something at the end of the novel to kind of drive home this point about the power of female connection. And I really love Adrienne Rich's poetry, and that kind of, it led me to some of her essays and to that quote. And yes, I think that's definitely what I would love like readers to take away from the novel. And I suppose I tried to convey that with the three characters, in the sense of the idea of legacy and like a connection happening across time. So without getting too spoilery, there is something in the cottage, like a physical object, although it's sort of more than an object, and that draws together the three women and their stories in a way that enables them to speak to each other across the centuries. And the younger women, as in time, are sort of empowered by learning the stories of the women who've lived before. And so I think that sense of like a connection across time, I wanted to draw a parallel with like feminism, really, and this movement that's had like all these different waves and different iterations through generations. And I think ultimately I wanted to make the point that, you know, our mothers and grandmothers have fought for so much and have fought so hard. And I think it's really important that we sort of carry on those lessons.
That's so beautiful, Emilia. Thank you for sharing that. In terms of the cottage itself, this is maybe me just, I love kind of really atmospheric settings in novels. And I think Wayward is a totally amazing example of that. Was there a particular cottage in the Lake District that you saw and you kind of thought, yeah, that's the one? Because I just love knowing the backstory, or was it kind of an amalgamation of the setting?
It was definitely an amalgamation. There were lots of like little cottages near where I was, the village where I was staying, that looked really atmospheric, but I didn't actually go inside them. And so what I ended up doing was I ended up taking a real place from Australia and kind of inserting it into the Cumbrian landscape in my head. And so that was my grandparents' house. So my grandparents live in this beautiful cottage in the Blue Mountains. And I think there's definitely, yeah, so the Blue Mountains is like obviously a mountainous region in New South Wales in Australia. And I think I felt like there was a sort of parallel between the Blue Mountains and the Lake District, because they both have like really rugged, majestic landscape. And I've always loved my grandparents' house. Like it's just beautiful. They have, it's I think about 200 years old. So obviously not as old as Wayward Cottage would be, but they have like a beautiful kitchen with the kind of copper pots hanging from the ceiling. And yeah, so that was very much like in my mind. And I wanted to sort of imbue that with like even more history and make it more Cumbrian as well. So yeah.
Oh no, that's also, I love hearing stories about that, like when sort of different things have come together, but obviously in the novel they're just sort of this seamless like cottage that comes from like nowhere. So it's incredible.
Yeah. I was just gonna say, like, I thought about it so much that it actually just began to feel like a real place in my head, which is, it's funny how that can happen. Yeah.
I wish that it was a real place because I want to go to it. But I guess you get to go to it through reading Wayward. So I'll have to live with that. There were some objects in the cottage. The objects kind of you mentioned, which are really key to the novel, which I won't go into. But there are also kind of books that are shared by these women, and I wanted to ask if you could tell us a bit about those, and also if kind of relate to know if there are any books that inspired you, if those books in the cottage was maybe a hint as to some of your reading material.
Yeah, that's a really great question. So basically, Kate, who's the modern day character, when she comes to Wayward Cottage, she reads the volumes on her great aunt's bookshelves. And that is like a way of connecting with her, and also a way of connecting with stories, because I wanted like the power of storytelling to be really prominent in the book. And so I quite intentionally included some like feminist volumes on her great aunt's bookshelves. So for instance, some by Virginia Woolf, like Orlando, and then poetry by Sylvia Plath, and some of which I've been able to quote in the book. And then also a novel called Lolly Willows by Sylvia Townsend Warner, which I think is like the first ever example of witch lit. So she
Because it's now known.
yeah. Yeah, so basically she wrote this book in the 1920s about this woman called Laura Willows, who she's living this quite like kind of in a way like I guess like a spinsterish life as they would have thought of it then, because she's an older woman and she's unmarried and she's basically under the financial care of her male relatives. And she kind of longs for independence and to lead her own life. So she quite abruptly moves to this village called Great Mop, where she adopts a kitten called Vinegar, and she meets the devil and makes a pact with him and becomes a witch. And that's how she achieves her independence. And yeah, so I read that while I was writing Wayward, and I just had to like put a nod to it in the book because it's just great. Like, honestly, I think everyone should read it.
Sounds amazing. And I mean, I'm always supportive of anything where there's an adopted cat, as well, just as an aside.
Yeah, I don't actually have a cat, which I feel like I should rectify because I think a cat would make a good familiar.
I think readers might expect some cat familiars. The animals are a really big part of Wayward. I'm relatively I'm not that familiar with the concept of familiars, and I was wondering if could you kind of explain that a little, and how sort of you brought that concept into Wayward too.
Yeah, sure. So I think this was another thing that I kind of came across during the research, like because I kind of knew about familiars in a vague sense, like it was an animal that was the companion of a witch, but reading about what like witch hunters actually thought they were was really shocking, because it was just so misogynist and horrible. But basically, and I think this is in things like demonology and like the Hammer of Witches and all those kind of key texts, that they basically believed that familiars, i.e. an animal that was in close association with a witch, was the devil taking animal form, like to basically suckle from the witch. And so the concept of a familiar was linked really closely to the idea of a witch's mark, i.e. like some kind of teat that these familiars, being the devil, could suckle from. And so yeah, I thought that was horrible. And it was also really interesting because back in the time, like in the 17th century, it was very normal for poorer families to like keep their animals like in the home with them, like for warmth. And so yeah, I just thought, women would have been kind of targeted for doing something that was very socially normal. And
for doing something which today is such a comfort as well, to have a pet and to have sort of like the companionship of animals, and for that to be turned against you is so disturbing and unpleasant.
Yeah, exactly. Like it's such a part of human culture. It has been for such a long time. And so I think I wanted to sort of play with that. And then I think I also felt as if all these comments about like women's teats and suckling, and like it was felt like such a hatred of the female body, as because the female body was something sort of unknown, and in many ways it still kind of is, sadly. And I guess I saw like a parallel with the natural world as being something unknown and underestimated. And so I wanted to like draw the two together, and make this like link with women and the natural world and like a kind of natural power, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that definitely comes across, and I love how the animals in Wayward are kind of transformed from that idea into being something which goes back to being kind of like that companionship and that power as well, which is amazing. I guess we've talked quite a lot about feminism, and about how a lot of the kind of witch hunts did have this really deep rooted misogyny. In Wayward, there are certainly some kind of awful villains, and I mean, I think we see in the very first page is how kind of Simon, Kate's boyfriend's kind of despicable behavior. there are kind of other male villains that emerge in the novel. How did you find creating the villains and sort of creating the male characters? And I mean, they're not all villains. So I was wondering if you could kind of speak to, was that a concern that kind of, you were leaning too heavily into that, and how did that process work?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I guess, you know, I've naturally kind of showcased the worst of male behavior, because in the novel I'm making a point about like misogyny and how it kind of has echoed through time and continues today. And so I was conscious of, you know, trying to draw together examples from different time periods, like the different ways that a woman might be persecuted by a man, whether that's, you know, witch hunts or domestic violence or something else. But I also thought, you know, it was really important that there were good male characters, because, you know, I mean, it doesn't need to be said that obviously not all men are abusive or coercive or whatever it is. And so I think that there are good, one of my favorite characters in the novel is Violet's brother, Graham, who, as in the opening pages, you know, she's quite cross with him, but I think he really does come into his own. And I really wanted to kind of highlight the power of their sibling relationship. And also, you know, to kind of showcase like a man, or I mean, he's quite a young man, so I guess you might say he's a boy, but acting like in a way that like helps women. And, you know, he supports his sister. Like he doesn't like, she doesn't need to be saved, but he helps her save herself. And it was really important to me to get that balance right as well. But anyway, I've got to be careful. I'm going to give spoilers.
Completely. It's always like, especially on like publication day like that, it's always really frightening. I love Graham as a character though, and I think his and Violet's sibling relationship and how that develops over time was really, really beautifully drawn. He was definitely one of my favorites as well. I also thought in Wayward that the male villains of the piece, I guess, are also, they are very kind of real characters, and as you said, sort of products of their time. So now I thought they were kind of amazing, like multifaceted characters in every instance.
Thank you so much.
The time span of the book, Emilia, is, so it's from like 1619, I think, when Alpha's story begins to present day. Did you like, how did you kind of go about crafting those different time periods, because they're so vividly done, and even the dialogue, you know, it all feels so kind of atmospheric and of the times. And what was that like, kind of creating those three defined periods?
Oh, I love this question. Yeah, it was difficult. I mean, it was fun, but I think I had to make a lot of choices about language and how to use language, particularly for like Alpha's time period, obviously being in the 17th century. I guess I wanted it to still feel, her voice to feel authentic and to not be jarring and like littered with anachronisms, but I also wanted it to feel like accessible for the reader. And so I guess I kind of was quite careful about the words that I used to signal we're in 1619 now, but in a way that isn't like alienating, if that makes sense. And then I had to do the same thing again with Violet's timeline in the 1940s, but that was easier because I think, you know, I had examples from fiction that I could turn to easily. And then I suppose the other challenge was keeping all of these voices and the timelines like separate in my head and not kind of getting them muddled, so that, you know, I didn't want the women's voices to like blur together too much. Although I hoped that they would like resonate with each other. So I basically wrote each timeline separately. So I wrote Alpha first. Yeah. So I didn't start off doing it that way, but then I realized that I was like, oh gosh, I can't pull this off unless I kind of do one at a time. Yeah, so I did Alpha, and then I had Violet kind of weave around her, and then Kate, I did Kate last. And you know, obviously when I was editing with my wonderful publishers, I did have to kind of dip in and out, but because I'd already kind of set them up, it was easier. Like I'd already created the world I could like fall back into. So yeah.
Was that sort of desire and the greater challenge of the kind of furthest back time frame, so Alpha's time frame and the time for the witch trials, was that one of the reasons that her voice is in the first person? And I guess there are other kind of reasons within the novel, but was that one of the reasons, or did that take a lot of thinking? I know you often hear about writers who are like, they started in the first person, they changed the third person, they changed back, and was there any of that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. Again, I think there are a few different reasons for her being in the first person. Obviously, one of them is plot related. But then I think I also felt like, you know, because I was reading these books about the witch trials, and a lot of the time, you know, the trials incorporated like confessions women had to make, and I don't know, I guess I kind of wanted to give these women like a voice in a way, and so it kind of made sense to use first person. And then I also thought, well, it will help me if I have first person for her, and then I have like close third person for the other two, and then I changed the tense between the two of them, and that just helped me like with that kind of switch. And I hoped that it would help the reader, because even though I could write them out separately, like I knew that I didn't want the reader to feel like confused about who was speaking. So I wanted there to be that sort of clue that, okay, you're back in this person's head now.
I love the idea of giving those women in the 17th century who were even kind of denied often fair trials. Well, often, yeah, fair trials, not always. But a voice that's a really kind of poignant reason behind it. These, you know, there's the three women characters are just fantastic, and they have like a real sense of, I think, magic to them. And I wanted to ask if you have a favorite witch in literature, and it may be we've already kind of touched on the books that inspired WEYWARD to some degree, but yeah, I just had to ask the question.
Oh, I love this. I think there are probably a lot. I mean, definitely Lolly Willows is one. And then I also love Circe, Madeline Miller's Circe. And I think she's such a kind of unusual kind of witch, because it's like combining Greek mythology and witchcraft. And then, but I mean, really, it's been something that I've kind of loved the idea of since childhood. Like, obviously, Harry Potter was like my big introduction to reading and the love of reading and like magical worlds. So I'd have to say that. And then also things like The Worst Witch and stuff like that. Yes. So yeah, there are just loads. I mean, I think this idea of like, you know, magic ability is something that's like children really love. And I think it's nice to, I mean, why should we have to leave that behind as we age? Yeah,
no, completely. And that I think that's one of the reasons people will just love this book, is because it does have a deep kind of sense of magic to it. I know we talked about the Lake District and how that landscape has this kind of majesty to it. Do you kind of do you sort of believe in the magic of nature to some degree, because that it comes out so strongly in WEYWARD, that kind of sort of power of the landscape and of the animals? Do you sort of feel that yourself, like when you're in particular places?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I wish I had like the abilities that the WEYWARD women have. Sadly, no. But yeah, I do think there's a real, I don't know, I think particularly at the time I was writing the book, I had this sense of the natural world as being rejuvenating, like restorative. And I think that's something that I've definitely experienced in my life. Like, just like something simple, like, you know, if you go for a walk in, whether that be in a park or in like bushland in Australia, and just being like feeling connected to like the world around you, I think that's really powerful, for like mental and physical health. And then also I really love drawing, and my favorite thing to draw would definitely be like the natural world, like insects and animals and birds and that sort of thing. Much easier than humans.
Easier than writing? Maybe not.
No, I mean, yes, no, I mean, everything's easier than writing.
On bad days, definitely.
Yeah.
For a totally different kind of source of inspiration, and you might not think this is inspiration at all, but Julie obviously introduced us both as being lawyers, or lawyers in past lives. Did you, kind of couldn't be further from nature and the Lake District, but do you take kind of any inspiration from that profession and from that kind of totally different style of writing?
Definitely. You know, I've always loved reading and writing, like for as long as I could like hold a book, basically. And I wrote a lot like as a teenager, but I have to say, like, there was some really purple prose going on. You know, like, why use one adjective when you could use 5? But and I think, you know, like studying law school and becoming a lawyer, I really learned like the power of like precision, I suppose. And like, it's really important to like every word in a sentence should sort of earn its place, I think. And I think that working with words in that way, like whether that was through contracts or like the wording of legislation, that really kind of drove that home for me. I don't know if maybe you feel the same way.
No, I do actually, and obviously, like, legal writing is not as, like, to me, it's not as interesting as fiction. But at the same time, I think there's that you do appreciate like the power of each word and how it can be construed by readers, and how readers are just as sort of discerning as any judge, really. Like, a word can change what a reader thinks about a character, and sort of totally change that in somebody's mind. So no, I think I do agree. Just about. And are there kind of any other kind of inspirations for Wayward? I guess we talked about sort of the landscape and sort of various inputs, the feminist side, the law. Is there anything else that sort of drove this book in your life at all?
Well, I think like a big reason why it felt so important to write the book when I did was because I did have this kind of vague idea I would do it around my 30th birthday, which was like approaching quickly as I wrote the book. But also, I think writing a novel was a dream I'd kind of like put very much on the back burner, like in my 20s. Working as a lawyer obviously was very time consuming. And then basically I had this like big event in my life, and I think that really reminded me, oh, this is something that I need to do this. So basically I had like a health incident where I had a stroke, which was like a big kind of shock. And it really did, I mean, it's a cliche, but it really did make me sort of rethink what was important. And it took a few more years for me to actually get to writing the novel. I started writing it, I think 3 years after the stroke, but I began writing like short fiction and half of a very bad memoir, you know, in that time. So I think it did really kind of spark that this was so important to me, and I had to make it happen because, yeah, I guess I realized, oh, you know, I mean, none of us really know what's around the corner.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Emilia. And before I sort of hand back to Julie for questions, just thank you for writing just such a beautiful and powerful novel. I just can't recommend Wayward enough. And thank you so much for speaking to us today.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thanks for all your wonderful questions.
Such a great conversation. I just want to come and have coffee with you two. You mentioned that you guys met last week. I just want to be in that group now. You two, like, you're going to have lots of fun from here on out. And you're so right, Abigail. Oh, everybody, just get this book and read this book. So we have lots of questions that came in. And pardon me if you already talked about this. I was doing some tech stuff when I first went. Did y'all talk about the title at all, Abigail, at the beginning, or no?
No, we didn't.
Okay. So I have a question before I get to the audience question. So Wayward has that double meaning-ish thing going on there. And so was that always the working title? Was it, where'd you come up with Wayward? I guess that's the question that comes to mind.
Well, anyone who knows me knows that I really love puns. So I kind of had to get one in there somehow.
You got a big one in.
Yeah. So I basically wanted a word that could be a place name, a family name, and have a kind of double meaning. And so I was looking for words that had some kind of connection to ideas about witches and witchcraft. And so, but basically Wayward is from Macbeth. So in the first folio edition of Macbeth, the three sisters, who are also called the Weird Sisters, were called the Wayward Sisters. So it's like an old English word for like weird or, you know, uncanny, otherworldly. And I felt like that was really perfect for women who are like breaking the mold in some way.
Fantastic. So it took a while to come around to it.
Yeah, I did. I had a few other, like I did have another working title, which was really bad. So I'm I can't repeat
Don't say it. Don't say it.
It's terrible. I don't think we'd be sitting here today if I'd kept that title.
Well, what's inside the pages count. So I think we might still be sitting here. So Stephanie's got some great questions. So her first one is, did you have the ending plotted out before you began writing, or did it evolve organically?
I love that question because I think every writer is different. It's probably different for every book. But I definitely had I had one scene from the ending to do with Kate's character. I had that like really clear in my mind from the beginning and was always going to be there. And then I kind of had to work out, okay, well, how do I get from the beginning to the end? And I think that's the hard part.
It's that darn middle.
So many words.
I know. It's like,
yeah, middle just gets in the way.
Yeah.
Okay, so you talked about Witchlit, and she says, do you think that Witchlit has been so popular in the past year or so? It's been around a while, but personally she thinks it's because it touches on female empowerment and resilience. And so you kind of touched on that a little bit, but do you think it's just why do you think it's become so popular?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is something that, like, the idea of a witch is something that female writers have kind of turned to over the years, like with the Lolly Willows example that I mentioned. But I think the fact, like, it's definitely sort of seems to be exploding right now. And I think that indicates a feeling of like frustration, you know, like that we're still kind of fighting for the things we've been fighting for like generations. And this misogyny still continues. And the fact that like the idea of a witch still feels relevant, you know, I think, yeah. I mean, you can take a kind of depressing interpretation from it, but I also think like the flip side of a witch who's persecuted is that, you know, she's a threat in some way because she's powerful. And so I think that that's also attractive as well. And it does resonate really well with female empowerment.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. And it feels like we're just living in Groundhog's Day.
Yeah.
On some of these things, which is just so depressing. Okay. This is a little bit of, well, she's got a couple questions for here. So which storyline was the easiest to write and which was the most challenging of the three characters?
So for some reason, I don't know why, because you would think it would be the opposite, but I found Alpha's story to be really easy, or not easy, but it just kind of easier. It sort of just was there in my head, I guess. Like, I mean, I did have to kind of stop every like 5 minutes to research something, you know, like what did they eat in this time? But I think just the trajectory of her story was really clear from the beginning, and her voice was really clear. And then I think the hardest was probably Kate. So that's the modern day character. And although she kind of came to me first, and I could see her beginning and I could see her end, it was hard to sort of get her from A to B. And I think part of that was she was the most like me, like being in the modern day. And so with the other characters, there was more escapism involved. So,
and you probably could create more. It was a more, you could really imagine more. Was there anything that surprised you in the research that you were just like, oh, didn't expect that?
Okay, I have got a really great but very strange fact. It actually is something that I don't want to give spoilers, but I did have to find out how pregnancy tests were conducted in the early 20th century. And I found out something that like totally blew my mind, which is that basically scientists would inject frogs with like a woman's urine, and whether or not it contained pregnancy hormones, if it did, then the frog would like, you know, spawn eggs or whatever. So I was really shocked by that. It didn't make its way into the book.
But fascinating.
Yeah, very strange.
Fascinating bit of just like, whoa, who knew? But isn't
it's
it amazing?
Honestly.
Isn't it amazing that when you think back at like how rudimentary things were, that like they even thought to do that?
Yeah, I know. It's really bizarre.
Yeah.
Like poor frogs.
No environmental, no protection agencies then. So this is so we're wrapping up here. Don't want to take up too much of your time, but got to have a closing question sort of for both of you. So Abigail, we talked earlier when I did the intro that you are working on your second novel. Is there anything that you want to share about that with us?
Yeah, it's called Day One. It's coming out early next year, and it is about conspiracy theories and how two different people can latch onto the ambiguities of a particular disaster. And as those two characters get closer to revenge or redemption.
Love it. Because conspiracy theories are going to be the end of us all, I think. So that sounds, you must have had some fun writing that.
Yeah, so it was written during COVID when conspiracy theories were potentially at their absolute peak. So I don't know if sometimes it was almost overwhelming.
Yeah. Oh, I bet. But yeah, but yeah, still kind of like,
it was fun too.
Yeah, to explore that. And so Emilia, Stephanie does have this last question for you, which I always hesitate asking because it's release day for you, but we want to know what's coming next. So are you working on something else?
Yes, I am. And I just have to say, I love the sound of your next book, Abigail. I'm so excited to read it. But yes, so I am working on another novel. It will also focus on female characters. And there will be a sprinkling of magic. But this time the setting is going to be the sea and the seaside. So yeah, that's a little taste.
So looking forward to that for sure too. And another probably beautiful cover. So want to thank both of you again for a great conversation. I need to thank our partners in this as the Book Carnival, Novel Neighbor, and Roundabout Books and Cafe. I see that some of you will be purchasing your books from those stores as well, and Warwick's as well. So ladies, thank you. It was a great conversation.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having us.
Excellent. When I say goodbye, we kind of go, we don't go back in a green room. So this is actually goodbye for us. So have a great rest of your, I think it's evening there, but soak up the evening of your release day.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And thanks, Abigail.
Bye everybody.
Thank you so much, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks everyone for coming.